It was supposed to be a simple, quiet stop. Steven Seagal sat inside a small roadside restaurant, the kind of place most travelers barely notice while driving past. The chairs were worn, the menu was basic, and the atmosphere was calm. Steven wasn't dressed like a movie star. No flashy clothes, no security, just a dark jacket, relaxed posture, and a man enjoying his meal in silence. To everyone else, he looked like an ordinary customer. That's when the door opened. 2 police officers stepped inside the restaurant, scanning the room casually, until their eyes landed on Steven. Something about him caught their attention. Maybe it was his calm confidence. Maybe it was the way he sat, completely unbothered. Whatever the reason, they walked straight toward his table. One officer stopped beside him and asked a question that felt unnecessary. Then another. Their tone wasn't friendly, it wasn't professional. It carried an edge. Steven looked up slowly and answered politely. Short. Respectful, calm, but instead of moving on, the officers lingered. They began questioning him again, where he was coming from, what he was doing there, why he was sitting alone. The questions didn't make sense. Other customers started to notice. Forks paused, mid-air. Conversations faded into quiet murmurs. Steven remained composed. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply met their gaze and responded with quiet confidence. The officers, however, seemed irritated by his calmness. One of them leaned closer, his voice sharper now, clearly trying to assert control. The peaceful atmosphere of the restaurant vanished. Tension filled the room like a heavy fog. People exchanged uneasy glances. Something felt wrong. This wasn't a routine check. This felt personal. Steven slowly placed his fork down, wiped his hands, and looked up again. Still calm, still controlled. He showed no fear, no anger, just patience. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know this quiet man had spent decades mastering discipline, control, and combat. They didn't know he was a global action legend, and they certainly didn't know what was about to happen next would leave everyone inside that restaurant completely stunned. The officers didn't move away. Instead, one of them pulled a chair back slightly and stood closer to Steven Seagal's table, invading his personal space. The other officer crossed his arms, watching every move Steven made, as if waiting for a mistake. The quiet restaurant began to feel smaller, tighter, like all the air had been pulled from the room. Mind telling us what you're doing here? One officer asked again, this time louder than before. Steven looked up calmly. His voice was steady when he replied. He explained that he was simply stopping for a meal while traveling. Nothing more. Nothing suspicious. But the officer shook his head, clearly unsatisfied. You got any ID on you? He demanded. Steven didn't argue. He reached slowly, deliberately, and showed his identification. No sudden movements, no attitude, just respect. The officers glanced at it briefly, but didn't hand it back right away. Instead, they exchanged a look. One that suggested they were enjoying the power of the moment. The second officer smirked. So you travel alone like this often? He asked, stopping at places like this. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around the restaurant, people had gone quiet. A couple at the next table stopped eating entirely. A truck driver near the window shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Everyone could feel it now. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. Steven noticed the stares but didn't react. He kept his hands visible on the table, his posture relaxed, his eyes calm. Years of discipline showed in every movement. He answered politely, never giving them a reason to escalate. Yet the officers continued pushing. Their voices grew sharper. Their questions became repetitive. Why here? Where were you earlier? How long are you staying? Each question chipped away at the peaceful moment that once filled the restaurant. A woman at the counter quietly pulled out her phone. Another customer followed. Soon, multiple cameras were pointed toward the table, recording everything. The officers noticed. One of them glanced around, irritation flashing across his face. Being watched clearly made him uncomfortable, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. His tone became more authoritative, more confrontational. You know we can take you outside if we need to, he said. The room froze. Steven finally looked directly at him, not with anger, but with a calm intensity that was impossible to ignore. When he spoke, his words were measured and respectful. "Officer," he said quietly, "I'm cooperating. I haven't done anything wrong." For a brief moment silence filled the room. Then the officer scoffed. "Don't tell me how to do my job." The tension reached a new level. People shifted in their seats. Someone whispered that this was getting out of hand. Another customer shook his head slowly, clearly uncomfortable with what he was seeing. And yet, Stephen remained steady. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand special treatment. He simply sat there, calm under pressure, refusing to be intimidated. If you're watching this right now, comment below which country and city you're watching from. As cameras continued recording, the officers seemed trapped by their own behavior. Walking away now would mean admitting they were wrong. Staying meant digging themselves deeper. The restaurant, once filled with casual chatter and clinking dishes, now felt like a courtroom. Every word spoken by the officers echoed. Every movement was being judged, not just by the people in the room, but by anyone who might see the footage later. Stephen gently folded his hands together and waited. He understood something the officers didn't. True power doesn't shout. True strength doesn't rush. And as the harassment continued, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone watching. These officers had no idea who Steven Seagal really was, and how badly they were underestimating him. The longer the officers stood there, the heavier the atmosphere became. One of them tapped the table with his knuckles, slow, deliberate, meant to unsettle. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet restaurant. Steven Seagal didn't move. He didn't look down. He didn't react at all. "Stand up," the officer said suddenly. The words cut through the room. A few people gasped softly. Someone near the back muttered under their breath, "For what reason?" Another customer shook his head, already knowing this was going too far. Stephen looked up, his eyes calm but focused. "Am I being detained?" he asked, his voice level and respectful. The officer hesitated. Just for a second. That pause said everything. "You're being questioned," he snapped. "Don't make this difficult." Stephen slowly pushed his chair back just a few inches, not standing, not resisting, just creating space. His movements were controlled, intentional, almost instructional. Anyone trained in discipline could recognize it immediately. "I'm not making anything difficult," Stephen replied. "I've answered your questions." The second officer stepped in closer now, clearly irritated that the situation wasn't unfolding the way he expected. "You're getting real comfortable for someone in your position," he said. That sentence changed the energy completely. People exchanged looks. "What position?" A man eating lunch. A woman at the counter whispered, "This isn't right." A trucker clenched his jaw. More phones were raised. The recording lights glowed brighter. Stephen glanced around the room, not nervously, but knowingly. He saw the concern on people's faces. He understood what this looked like, and he understood what silence could mean in moments like this. Still, he chose calm. "I respect the law," he said evenly. "But respect goes both ways." The officer laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You don't get to lecture us." The tension snapped tighter. For a moment, it felt like anything could happen. The officers were clearly frustrated. Their authority wasn't working the way it usually did. Stephen wasn't afraid. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't submissive either. He was balanced. One officer radioed something quietly, turning slightly away. The other kept his eyes locked on Stephen, watching his hands, his posture, waiting, hoping for a mistake. Stephen kept his hands visible, resting calmly on the table. A young man near the window whispered to his friend, "Why is he so calm?" His friend replied, "Because he's not scared." The officers tried another tactic. "We can take you outside," one of them said. "Things can get more complicated if you keep pushing." Stephen met his eyes. "I'm not pushing," he said. "I'm standing." That line landed hard. The room went quiet again. So quiet you could hear a spoon drop somewhere behind the counter. "Be honest. If this were you, would you stay calm like Stephen? Or would you speak up? Let us know in the comments." The officer's jaw tightened. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged with composure instead of anger. He took a step back, then forward again, trying to reassert control, but something had shifted. The crowd was no longer neutral. They were watching the officers now. Not Stephen. Every word, every gesture, Stephen could feel it. The officers could feel it too. Power was slipping, not because of force, but because of restraint. Stephen leaned back slightly, his voice still calm, still measured. "I'm happy to cooperate," he said, "but I won't be disrespected without cause." The officers exchanged another look. This time it wasn't confidence, it was uncertainty. They had intended to intimidate a man into submission. Instead, they had turned a quiet roadside restaurant into a public test of authority, dignity, and self-control. And as the cameras kept rolling, one truth became impossible to ignore. This situation was no longer under their control, and the real turning point was just moments away. The silence didn't last long. A man sitting near the window leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes as he studied Steven Seagal more carefully. At first it was just curiosity, then confusion, then something closer to disbelief. He whispered to the woman sitting across from him, "Does that guy look familiar to you?" She glanced over casually, then looked again. Her eyebrows slowly lifted. Across the room, another customer had stopped pretending to scroll on his phone. He was staring now, openly. His gaze moved from Stephen's face to his posture, then back again. The calm, the confidence, the unmistakable presence. Something clicked. A low murmur rippled through the restaurant. "No way. Is that who I think it is? That looks like..." The words never finished. But the idea spread fast. Stephen noticed the change immediately. Not fear, not anger, recognition. He felt the room shift around him. He kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral, refusing to react. He had been recognized before, many times. But never like this. Not in a roadside restaurant. Not in the middle of a tense standoff with police. The officers didn't seem to notice the whispers at first. One of them was too focused on maintaining control, his voice sharp as he repeated the same questions yet again. The other glanced around, irritated by the growing attention. What's with all the staring? One officer snapped at the room. That only made it worse. A woman near the counter leaned toward her friend. "That's Steven Seagal," she whispered. "I'm almost sure." Her friend shook his head slowly. No way. He'd never just be sitting here. But the doubt in his voice betrayed him. Another phone rose higher, zooming in. Stephen shifted slightly in his seat, not to hide, but to remain grounded. He didn't confirm anything. He didn't deny it either. He stayed exactly who he had been since the first moment, calm, controlled, respectful. One of the officers finally noticed the phones. He turned sharply. "Is there a problem here?" No one answered, but the look said everything. For the first time since the encounter began, the officer hesitated. "What?" he asked again, louder now. "Why is everyone recording?" A man near the back spoke up carefully. "Because this doesn't look right," the officer scoffed. "Mind your business." But it was already everyone's business. The second officer leaned toward Stephen again, lowering his voice. "You enjoying the attention?" he muttered. Stephen met his gaze unshaken. "I'm not seeking it," he said quietly. "I'm just here to eat." That response only deepened the unease. Another whisper traveled through the room. Clearer this time. "That's definitely him. The actor, the martial artist, the Aikido guy." Stephen exhaled slowly through his nose. He still didn't say a word about who he was. He didn't flash fame. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't use status as a shield. The officers, however, were now visibly uncomfortable. Their posture changed, less aggressive, more rigid. The confidence they had entered with was starting to crack. Not because they knew who Stephen was, but because they sensed they might have misjudged him badly. One officer leaned toward the other and whispered something under his breath. Stephen caught just enough of it to know the tone had changed. Around them, the restaurant felt electric. Like a moment before a storm breaks, everyone sensed it. The truth was hovering in the air, close enough to touch, but not yet spoken out loud. And that delay made things dangerous. Because the longer the officers remained unaware, the worse this could become. Stephen sat perfectly still, hands resting calmly on the table. He wasn't waiting for recognition. He was waiting to see what kind of men they chose to be, with or without knowing who he really was. And as the whispers grew louder and the cameras kept rolling, one thing became absolutely clear. The officers were running out of time, and the moment of truth was coming fast. The officer's patience finally snapped. He straightened his shoulders, squared his stance, and spoke louder, clearly intending to reassert dominance in front of the growing crowd. "All right," he said sharply. "We've asked you enough times. You're going to stand up now, or we'll make this more complicated than it needs to be." Every sound in the restaurant seemed to disappear at once. "That's all I've been asking for." No sarcasm. No triumph. Just composure. The restaurant felt different now, lighter, clearer. Like a storm had passed its peak. Stephen didn't press further, he didn't insult them. He didn't demand apologies, he simply waited, because he knew something the officers didn't yet fully grasp. The truth was already out there. The cameras had captured everything, and the next few minutes would decide how this story ended. As the officers exchanged uncertain glances and the crowd watched in silence, one reality became unavoidable. Steven Seagal hadn't taken control through force. He had taken it through discipline. And the moment of full realization, the moment everything changed completely, was now unavoidable. The restaurant door opened again. This time the sound cut through the tension like a blade. A third police officer stepped inside, older, calmer, with the posture of someone who had been on the job long enough to recognize when a situation was already on the edge. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the silence, the raised phones, the frozen body language. Then his gaze landed on Steven Seagal. He stopped. Just for a second, but it was enough. His expression changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. His brows tightened slightly. His posture straightened. He knew. The two officers at the table didn't notice at first. They were still trying to regain control, still clinging to authority that had already slipped away. One of them spoke quickly, gesturing toward Stephen. "We've got a non-cooperative individual here," he said, refusing to. The senior officer raised a hand. "That's enough," he said firmly. The room went silent again. He stepped closer, looking directly at Stephen now. Not as a suspect, not as a problem, but with recognition and respect. "Mr. Seagal," he said carefully. That name landed like thunder. Every whisper stopped. Every phone froze mid-recording. Every breath in the room seemed to pause at once. The two officers turned slowly. "What?" one of them asked. The senior officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This is Steven Seagal," he said. "International film actor, martial artist, Aikido master." The realization hit hard. One officer's face drained of color. The other's eyes widened, darting between Stephen and the crowd, then to the phone still recording every second. Stephen didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't confirm. He didn't correct. He simply sat there, exactly as he had from the beginning. Calm. Composed, grounded. The senior officer turned back to him. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I apologize for the inconvenience. May I ask what seems to be the issue here?" Stephen met his gaze. "There doesn't need to be an issue," he replied quietly. "I was just having a meal. That was it. No accusations, no ego, no power play." The contrast was impossible to ignore. The two officers stood stiffly now, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Not because Stephen was famous, but because the entire encounter had been recorded before they knew who he was. And everyone in the room understood that. A man near the window whispered, "So they'd still be doing this if he was nobody." A woman near the counter nodded slowly. "That's the problem." The senior officer turned to his colleagues, his tone firm but controlled. "Step back," he said, "now." They obeyed immediately. Stephen finally stood. Not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. He rose slowly, effortlessly, his presence filling the room without intimidation. He looked at the officers, not with anger, not with triumph, with disappointment. One bystander would later say, "I didn't tell you who I was," Stephen said calmly, "because it shouldn't matter." Those words cut deeper than any confrontation. I didn't want special treatment, he continued. I wanted fair treatment. The kind everyone deserves. The senior officer nodded once. You're absolutely right, he said. Let us know in the comments, do you think this would have ended differently if his identity was never revealed? The officer stood in silence. There was no apology spoken aloud yet, but the weight of accountability was heavy in the room. Cameras captured every second. The truth was undeniable now. Stephen picked up his jacket calmly. I respect the badge, he said, but respect has to be practiced, not demanded. No shouting, no threats, no humiliation, just truth. The senior officer assured him the matter would be handled. The two officers avoided eye contact now, fully aware that this moment would follow them far beyond this restaurant. As Stephen walked toward the door, the room parted naturally. People watched with quiet respect. Some nodded, some whispered. Some simply stood in silence, not because he was a celebrity, but because he had shown something rare: strength without force, authority without aggression, power without ego. And as the door closed behind him, one thing was certain: this story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and the world was about to see it. By the time Steven Seagal reached his next stop, the video had already begun spreading. What started as a few quiet recordings inside a roadside restaurant was now exploding across social media. Clips appeared on every platform. Short edits, long versions, slowed down moments with captions, highlighting every word Steven had spoken. Calm under pressure. Respect over power. This is how real strength looks. Millions watched. Not because it was a celebrity encounter, but because it was painfully relatable. People recognized the tension, the unfair questioning, the shift in tone once identity was revealed. Comment sections filled faster than anyone could scroll. He didn't use fame to protect himself. That's how authority should be challenged, without violence. What if he wasn't famous? That's the real issue. News outlets picked up the story within hours. Some focused on Steven Seagal's composure. Others focused on the officer's behavior before they knew who he was. Debates erupted about profiling, accountability, and the quiet power of self-control. One clip went especially viral. It showed Steven saying, "I didn't tell you who I was because it shouldn't matter." That line became the headline. Law enforcement officials released a short statement confirming the incident was under review. The department promised an internal investigation. The two officers involved were temporarily reassigned pending further evaluation. But Steven Seagal never commented publicly beyond one short message. "There's no need for anger," he wrote. "There's only a need for awareness." That silence spoke louder than outrage ever could. Fans praised him, not for his movies, not for his martial arts, but for his restraint. Even critics admitted something rare had been displayed. Dignity in the face of provocation. Inside the restaurant, the story lingered. The waitress told reporters she would never forget how calm he was. A customer said, "He made everyone feel safer just by staying composed." Another admitted, "That moment changed how I see power." Steven returned to his life quietly, no interviews, no victory lap, because to him, this was never about winning. It was about showing that true strength doesn't escalate. It stabilizes. True authority doesn't threaten. It listens. And real respect isn't demanded. It's earned. If you believe no one should ever be judged by appearance, type respect in the comments. And subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truth behind real strength. The video continued to spread, not as a scandal, but as a reminder. Anyone can raise their voice. Very few can raise the standard. And that's why this moment, this quiet roadside encounter, became something far bigger than anyone ever expected.